Last spring, I tried to calculate the ROI of a walk. Not metaphorically. I stood at the end of my street and thought, what did that produce? What do I have to show for 40 minutes? I built businesses for 30 years, sold one, consulted on others. I know how to make time count. What I didn't know, what retirement made impossible to ignore, is that I'd been using output as a measure of self-worth for so long that I no longer had another measure available. And dismantling that is a different kind of work than anything I've done before. My name is Diane Kaufman. I'm 66 years old, and I want to tell you something that I find genuinely embarrassing to admit, which is that I tried to calculate the ROI of a walk last spring, not metaphorically. I stood at the end of my street 40 minutes in and found myself thinking, what did that produce? What do I have to show for 40 minutes? I caught myself mid-thought, recognized what I was doing, stopped, and then I did it again the next morning. I built businesses. I sold one, consulted on others, made decisions about where to put time and capital for most of my adult life. The savings are in order. The fixed income structure we built works. The retirement I planned financially is, for all practical purposes, fine. The retirement I actually have to live inside, that's a different question. Here's what I didn't plan for. I spent so many years making everything count for something that I genuinely don't know how to do something that counts for nothing. Rest without recovery. Pleasure without output, an afternoon with no deliverable attached to the end of it. I thought that was just an adjustment period, something that would soften with time. I'm not sure it softens. I think it requires something more active than waiting. The routine I have now looks from the outside like a person who has figured retirement out. I'm not going to pretend that's the full story. The purpose question. What am I for if not for producing something? That one doesn't answer itself just because the financial structure is solid. I don't know how to do things with no ROI, and I've been trying to figure out whether that's a problem to solve or something I need to let go of entirely. Those are different projects. Here's what I actually think is happening, and it took me longer than it should have to name it clearly. You wake up, the day is open, and there's this low-grade pressure, not anxiety, not quite, more like a persistent accounting. You read for an hour, and something in the back of your mind wants to know what it was for. You have lunch with a friend, and on the way home you notice you're tallying whether the time was well spent. You sit in a garden that you actually love, and you feel, faintly but consistently, like you're getting away with something. That's the specific feeling I want to name. Not boredom, not depression, something more precise. The sensation that time spent without a measurable result is time that will need to be accounted for somewhere. I spent decades building that reflex. It made me effective. It made me someone other people wanted in a room. It also made me, in retirement, a person who cannot fully occupy a morning that doesn't produce anything. I'm not going to tell you I've resolved this. I haven't, completely. What I'm going to tell you is what I found when I finally looked at it directly instead of rooting around it with another project. And what Richard said, which I didn't want to hear, and which was, as usual, correct. No systems, no 5-step framework. Just what I actually discovered, in the order I discovered it. So we're at home on the Saturday. This was maybe 8 weeks after I'd fully stepped back. Richard is reading, just reading, in the chair he's had for 15 years, with the particular quality of stillness he has always had, and which I have always, depending on the day, either admired or found slightly maddening. He was fine. Immediately, irritatingly fine. I was ostensibly also relaxing. I had reorganized a drawer, checked my phone twice for no reason, moved a vase from one end of a shelf to the other, gone to the kitchen, returned without anything, stood at the window with my coffee going cold. Richard didn't look up. He said, "You're auditing your morning again." I said I didn't know what that meant. He put the book down, slowly, which is how he does everything, and he explained that he had watched me, in the past 40 minutes, perform approximately 7 tasks that didn't need doing, in the manner of a person trying to demonstrate productivity to an empty room. I told him that was an uncharitable interpretation. He picked the book back up. The problem was that he was right. I was auditing my morning. I was moving through a weekend with no demands on it, the way I used to move through a quarterly review, looking for the gaps, the inefficiencies, the time that wasn't pulling its weight. I had brought the entire apparatus of how I worked into a Saturday that asked nothing of me. It took me about a week to admit that out loud. In that week, I started 2 projects, one of which I abandoned after 4 days when I realized I was treating a hobby like a business plan, and one of which I'm still doing, but have had to actively resist turning into something with a deliverable. That was when I understood. The work wasn't the problem. The framework I'd used to give the work meaning, that was the thing I'd accidentally applied to everything else too. I'd built a life I was genuinely proud of, and I had built it in a way that made the part after the building quite difficult to inhabit. So I want to go through 5 things I've noticed since then. 5 specific things about what it actually costs to be someone who measured everything, and what happens when the measuring stops being useful. I wish someone had said these to me plainly, earlier. That's what I'm going to try to do here. The first thing I figured out is this. The ROI mentality was never a work habit. It was how I assigned value to myself. I want to be precise about that distinction, because I spent quite a while misunderstanding it. I thought the problem was that I'd brought a professional framework into my personal life, which was true, but incomplete. The deeper issue was that the framework wasn't just a tool I used. It was the system by which I decided, at the end of each day, whether I had justified my existence in it. I went to an exhibition last fall, a painter I'd wanted to see for years, one of those things that was always on a list that never reached the top. Richard suggested it. We went on a Thursday afternoon, which still feels slightly illicit to me, a Thursday afternoon with no other claim on it. I spent 2 hours there. I genuinely loved it. Stood in front of one painting for probably 12 minutes, which is not something I do. And then we walked out into the afternoon and I felt, arriving quietly and without invitation, a kind of low-grade dissatisfaction. Not with the exhibition, with myself, with how I'd spent the time. I stood on the pavement outside and thought, what do I have to show for this afternoon? The answer was nothing. 2 hours, a parking fee, and nothing to show. And that felt wrong. That's when I figured out the scope of the problem. It wasn't that I'd imported work habits into my free time. It was that I'd been using output as a proxy for self-worth for so long that I no longer had another measure available. The exhibition was beautiful. I had nothing to show for it. Those 2 facts were in conflict, in my head, in a way they absolutely should not have been. I've been trying since then to find a different measure. I don't have one yet that works as cleanly. That's an honest answer. Here's where I'll admit something that I find genuinely funny in retrospect, though it was not funny at the time. My solution to the ROI problem was to immediately create projects with ROI. I'm not proud of this. I'm also not surprised. I've been solving problems by building structures around them for 40 years. It is, to a fault, what I do. So when I identified the problem, I don't know how to do things that don't produce anything. My first instinct was to produce a solution to the problem of not producing things. The circularity of this did not occur to me at the time. I took a painting class. I evaluated my progress weekly. By week 4, I had a rubric. I started a garden. Within 3 weeks, I had researched optimal soil composition, drawn a planting diagram, and calculated the cost per unit of homegrown herbs versus buying them at the market. The herbs were not cheaper. I had a spreadsheet. Richard found the spreadsheet. He said nothing. He had the expression he gets when he has decided that silence is his best option. I attempted to write something, a memoir loosely, or at least notes toward one. I wrote 40 pages in 6 weeks. They were competent. They were also written for an imagined audience, which meant they were performing rather than actually saying anything. I could feel the performance in every sentence, and I stopped. 3 projects, approximately 4 months. Every single one colonized by the same framework I was trying to escape. That's when I figured out that having a project isn't the same as solving the problem. A project is still a container for output. It still has a finish line, explicit or implied. What I actually needed to learn was something different, and I didn't have a name for it yet, and I didn't know how to build a project around it because the point was specifically that it couldn't be a project. Richard, to his considerable credit, did not say "I told you so." He did say once, "You know you don't have to fix this by next quarter." I told him I wasn't working on a quarter. He looked at me for a moment and went back to his book. I don't fully understand this next one. I want to say that plainly because I think claiming to understand it completely would be dishonest, and this channel doesn't have room for that. There is a version of rest I have never, as an adult, actually experienced. And I discovered this the way you discover most useful things, by accident, while trying to do something else. I was sitting on the terrace one morning, coffee, good light. Richard was inside. I had told myself I was going to sit for a while before starting the day, by which I meant I was going to sit for approximately 10 minutes, feel that I'd done it, and move on. I sat for close to an hour. Not because I'd decided to, not because I'd read something recommending it. I just didn't get up. The coffee went lukewarm. The light shifted. A bird that I don't know the name of sat on the garden wall for a while and then left. I watched it go. And the entire time there was this low, persistent discomfort. Not physical, something more like the feeling of being late to something, the feeling of an unanswered message, the sensation that I was accruing a debt, that this hour was being borrowed from somewhere and would need to be paid back. I didn't move. I sat with it. And about 40 minutes in, something shifted, very slightly. I don't know how to describe it precisely, which is unusual for me. The discomfort didn't go away. It just became less loud, like it had said what it needed to say and was now waiting to see what I'd do. That's when I figured out that what I'd been calling rest for most of my adult life was actually recovery. Recovery is rest with a purpose attached. You rest in order to return, in order to perform, in order to produce the next thing. It's useful. It works. It is not the same as being still without a reason. I had been recovering effectively for decades. I had never just been still. I don't know why that hour felt like one of the harder things I'd done recently. I genuinely don't. I have made difficult decisions under real pressure. I have had conversations I would not want to repeat. This was a woman sitting on a terrace with cold coffee, and it was hard. That tells me something. I'm still not sure exactly what. I told Richard about that morning about a week later. I described it with some precision because imprecision bothers me and because I wanted to understand what he would make of it. He listened. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Diane, what if the point isn't to find something meaningful to do with retirement? What if the point is to find out who you are when you're not doing something meaningful?" I started to respond. I had a response ready, something about how identity and activity aren't mutually exclusive, how one doesn't have to stop producing to understand oneself, something like that. Reasonable, articulate, a solid counter-argument. I stopped before I delivered it, because what I'd assembled wasn't a counter-argument, it was a defense, and I know the difference. I've been on the other side of enough negotiations to know when someone is arguing and when someone is protecting something they haven't examined. I was protecting something I hadn't examined. Richard didn't press. He doesn't press. He says the thing once, clearly, and then leaves it on the table for you to pick up when you're ready. It's one of the qualities I find most useful in him, and occasionally most difficult, because it doesn't give me anything to push against, which means I have to sit with it instead. I sat with it for about 2 weeks. The question, "Who are you when you're not producing something?" is a question I had managed to avoid for the better part of 40 years. Not deliberately, not dishonestly. I was simply always producing something, so the question never had room to arrive. Retirement cleared the room, and the question walked in and sat down and showed no signs of leaving. Here's what I've found so far, and I want to be honest that "so far" is the operative phrase. I don't fully know the answer. I know pieces of it. I know I'm someone who finds genuine pleasure in very specific things. A particular quality of morning light, a conversation that goes somewhere unexpected, a sentence in a book that stops me cold. I knew those things about myself before. I didn't know that I'd been treating them as rewards for finished work, rather than as things that were simply mine. That's a small distinction that has turned out to be quite large. I had lunch with Sophie last month, my daughter. She's 37, building her own thing, carrying the particular exhaustion of someone doing several things at once without wanting to admit that any of them is too much. She asked me, at some point in the middle of lunch, how I was finding retirement. The real answer, not the polished version. She's the only one who asks that way, and she knows when she's getting the polished version. I told her some of what I've been telling you, the ROI reflex, the terrace morning, the question Richard asked. She listened the way she listens, with one part of her mind on what I'm saying and another part already turning it over for her own use, which is a quality she got from me and which I recognize completely. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I can't imagine a day without an objective. I genuinely can't." I said, "I know, I couldn't either." And then, and I thought about this afterward for quite a while, I said, "Keep that in mind, for later." She nodded like she understood. I'm not sure she did completely. I'm not sure I would have at 37. There are things that can be described very accurately and still not land until you're standing in them. What I noticed, sitting across from my daughter at that lunch table, was that I was looking at a version of myself from 25 years back, capable, directed, completely fluent in the language of output. And I felt something I didn't expect. Not nostalgia, something more complicated, a kind of tenderness toward that version, and a quiet hope that she finds her way to the terrace sooner than I did. Not because the terrace is the answer, I don't know that it is, but because the question, "Who are you outside of what you produce?" is worth asking before retirement forces the asking. I'm not going to tell you I've solved this. I haven't. What I'll say is that the mornings are different now. Not all of them. Some of them I'm still auditing, still tallying, still looking for something to show. But some mornings, more than there used to be, I sit on the terrace and the discomfort is quieter. Not gone, quieter. My mother was elegant without effort. That was her gift. She existed fully in whatever room she was in, without needing the room to give her anything back. I've been thinking about that lately. I spent decades assuming that quality was temperamental, something you either had or didn't. I think now it might be something you learn, slowly and imperfectly, and without a deliverable at the end of it. I'm working on it. Leave a comment. Tell me this. Is there something you genuinely enjoy that you can't do without feeling like you should be doing something else instead? Something that should feel like pleasure, but arrives with this low-grade sense that you're getting away with something. I want to know if that's particular to people who built things, or whether it's more common than I think. I read every comment. I find them genuinely useful. If any of this resonated, hit the like button. And if you know someone who spent their career producing things and is now trying to figure out who they are when the producing slows down, send this their way. These are conversations worth having before retirement forces them. If you want more of this, honest, unpolished conversation about what it actually takes to move through this chapter well, subscribe. That's what this channel is for. Take care of yourselves.